Hi, a warm welcome. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to a very special session curated by Edelweiss Private Wealth. This session is about budget, the budget that we just had a few days ago. And a lot of people has hailed it as one of the best budgets in a very long time. And I think there were a lot of new announcements and there were a lot of announcements which were not made. A mix of both made this a very memorable week and a budget which has a lot to think about, a lot of data to decipher, and a lot of trends to understand. So we will address all of them today. So to talk about this and more, we have a very special guest today, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's a pleasure to have you, sir, here. Good evening and welcome. Uh, Mr. Ahluwalia, he was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, the first director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF, and he was actually the youngest division chief in the World Bank's bureaucracy. He's held several positions as a civil servant, including Special Secretary to Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary of Department of Economic Affairs in the Finance Ministry, and Finance Secretary. He's been awarded with Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian honor for public service. And I think to some extent, he's the backbone of Indian reforms agenda and the driving force behind the rise of Indian private sector. And he's set tone for a lot of reforms, a lot of them which focus on growth. So a very warm welcome to Mr. Ahluwalia. Welcome, Mr. Ahluwalia. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you. So let me start off with a question on the broader aspect of the Indian economy. You see, India has clocked one of the lowest growth in decades in FY20. We were at mid-fours and nominal growth at 7.5%. And since the global financial crisis in 2008, our real growth has been just at about 6%. The question is, what does it take to get back to 8%? Do we have enough of that? Do you think we go to 8%, or is 5 the new 8%? What are the challenges according to you? How do you see the Indian economy at this point? Over to you, sir.
Well, as you said, this is an exceptional year. I mean, we, like other economies, have been badly hit by the COVID pandemic, and we're going to see a negative growth. Numbers are always uncertain, but the official number for negative growth is about minus 7.7%, which is pretty grim. Others think it could be worse. So I think next year, there's also evidence, by the way, that the sharp decline that took place was concentrated in the first half of the year. There's some dispute about what's going to happen in the second half, but it does look as if the economy is getting out of the worst. So it's on the uptick. Now, how sharply it will revive, we will only know a little bit later. But whatever it is, following a decline of 7.7%, it would not be surprising to me if in the next year, that is the year 21-22, we will show a growth rate which could be even 8% or even a little bit more than 8% in real terms. That's only going to bring us back to where we were in 2019-20. So that's not really what I would call a post-pandemic growth rate. That's just getting back to square one. So your real question is, how do we look positioned for growth after that? In other words, in the year 22-23. Now, we have to do some things to actually have a recovery, and we can discuss that. But going beyond the recovery, I mean, the honest truth is that in the 2 or 3 years before the pandemic, we had already slowed down. The most recent year, it was down to about 4+%. Before that, around 5%. And therefore, the issue is, are we just going to go back to something between 4 and 5? Or do we have a chance of getting back to the high growth rates that we did enjoy in the previous years? Depending on which period you look at, I mean, India at one stage grew for 4 or 5 years at 9%. During the whole of the UPA period, it averaged at 7.6%. During the first 3 years of the NDA under the Modi government, it also averaged pretty close to that. But then after 17, it slowed down. Now, I think we need to look at why that slowdown occurred. Some part of that slowdown may be that the global economy wasn't doing all that well. But I feel that we ran into internal constraints, and in order to get back to high growth, we need to overcome those constraints. So the question really is, do we have the capacity to get back, in principle, to growth rates between 7 and 8%? I think we do, but not as an automatic assumption. I think we have to address why we were slowing down and then correct that. Now, I think one of the big things that made us slow down was really the slowing down of private investment. I mean, private investment went sharply down. We need to look at why that happened. We need to correct that. And I think that's what people think of when they think of restarting the reforms process. So a lot will depend on how that plays out in the next year or two.
Sure, understood, sir. So let me connect that to the budget. Do you think the problems, for example, you spoke about private investment slowdown. Do you think budget addresses the problems at hand right now that takes us probably back to 8%? Are some of these problems being addressed by the budget that we just had?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is, to the credit of the budget makers, I don't think the budget makes any big mistakes. I mean, sometimes budgets do things that are completely wrong. I don't think there's anything very wrong in this budget. I think there's some good thing in the budget that they have acknowledged that the fiscal deficit is very high. I mean, everybody knew that that it was higher than it was thought to be. And I think everybody also knew that in a pandemic year, it was going to be higher than it otherwise would be, simply because revenues were going to collapse. I think for a certain period, there was uncertainty whether the government was willing to tolerate a higher fiscal deficit. And I believe they were actually holding back expenditure in the first 6 months, somehow hoping that they wouldn't exceed the budget deficit too much. I think that was a mistake. It would have been much better to say, well, look, if the economy is doing as badly as it looks like it's doing, then basically we're going to have a big shortfall of revenues, and we don't mind a higher expenditure, a higher fiscal deficit. I think the way the budget has come out, they've acknowledged that, they put it on the table, and you're going to have a 9.5% fiscal deficit for the current year, which is the highest we've ever had. And if you add to that around 4.5% or so for the states, we're going to have a combined fiscal deficit of 14%, central and states combined. That's very big. I think that was the right thing to come clean on that, so I give them marks for this. Next year, that's the other thing, that next year, the budget doesn't say that everything is going to be back to normal. Because, from the 9.5, they're projecting going to 6.8. 6.8 would normally be regarded as a pretty high fiscal deficit. And personally, I think that's the right thing to do, because we shouldn't get fooled into thinking that the economy is actually recovered. We will know what the results are later. But, when I talk to a lot of businessmen, there are very few in certain sectors who may say that their revenues are better than last year. Most of the optimism is the feeling that the economy is recovering. They're getting back to where they were in 2019-20. Plus, I think the feeling, there's obviously always an irrational exuberance in the stock market. Around the world, the stock markets are completely delinked from what's happening in the real economy, and that's the consequence of a huge amount of liquidity. So I don't think we should assume that because stock markets are booming, therefore the economy is actually moving. So clearly the fact that they're booming is a good thing. It will help some people. Maybe they can realize some wealth, etc., etc. I feel that if you look at it from that point of view, basically, the positive things that the budget has done, other than coming clean on the fiscal deficit and recognizing that we are going to have a phased transition to a more normal level, they've mentioned a number of things which are an indication of steps which will lead to better performance maybe in the years ahead. I think the most important of those, the most immediate positive impact would be the rise in the FDI limit for insurance, taking it up to 74%. I mean, there are lots of companies where people would want to raise their shareholding. It's a very positive signal. It'll make them feel that, look, India's on the move. So that's certainly good. I think the signal that we intend to do big time privatization of the public sector in the so-called non-strategic areas is a very good signal. But how much we do in the course of the current year is going to depend upon how it's implemented. And we've had these signals before, and
Yes.
we've seen situations where it's announced, but then it doesn't happen. So it depends on how it gets implemented. I think the biggest constraint over the next year and beyond that, biggest constraint which we need to address urgently is really, I think there are two. One is fixing the GST. I mean, the GST, by any standard, is an unduly messy tax, is a brilliant idea. I'm glad that it happened. But, we need to have drastically reduced number of rates, a single rate across most commodities. I know that it can't be done except by the GST Council. And to her credit, she has said, we're going to discuss this. I would have been happier if they had taken the view the central government has decided that this is what we're going to take up in the GST Council. Because remember, the GST Council, most of the states are BJP states. So if they get a high-level signal that the political leadership wants to simplify, the chances are that it'll get done. And I didn't find that there, so I'm a little disappointed on that. The second urgent thing is fixing the banking system. And frankly, I think there, what has been provided for recapitalization of the public sector banks is actually quite small, 20,000 crores.
Sure, 20,000, yes.
The banks, they were improving in their NPAs, but once the regulatory relaxations that were done under the stimulus package are over, many of these loans are going to turn NPA. And it's not very clear how they're going to provide for them. It would be a bad signal if we kick the can down the road and don't start providing for them. If you provide for them, then there'll be capital shortage. And really, the only positive thing there, and it is a positive thing in my view, is that they're going to privatize two small public sector banks. But believe me, privatizing two small public sector banks is very good longer term signal, but it'll take several months to get it done. So I don't expect it to lead immediately to anything in the course of the next 6 months or so.
Sure.
I think the idea of setting up an asset management and asset reconstruction company, sort of what was called the bad bank, to help banks deal with existing NPAs and then get on with more lending, that's a good idea. But again, it needs to be put in place with great clarity very quickly. And I would have hoped that that clarity would have been laid out fully in the budget. I think it has been said, quite a bit has been said, but I think we need to see how fast that actually moves. The other thing is, for that to work, the insolvency and bankruptcy code proceedings should be restarted. And I mean, they have got stuck a bit. So I think we need action in all these areas. Along with that, we actually needed banking sector reform. I mean, the public sector bank reform program isn't there. I mean, I've seen several proposals short of privatization, setting up like the PJ Nayak committee. And I think if they'd said we're going to do that, that would at least have given some indication that something different. That's not happened. I'm a little concerned about one thing. One of the biggest, while I think the government has given very strong positive signals on things like supporting the private sector, supporting infrastructure investment, which I think is very crucial in the Indian context as a way of supporting private investment. I mean, we have regressed, I think, in the tendency to raise customs duties. This
Yes.
budget, we haven't done too much on duties, some increase, some reduction. But what the finance minister has said is that by October, they're going to review something like 400 customs duty exemption limits. Now, exemptions usually lower customs duties. So that basically means that in all these things, customs duties are going to rise. I think it's important to know what is the principle that we are following on duties. Do we subscribe to the view that customs duties should be moderate and more or less uniform across sectors, with maybe one or two strategic sectors being differentiated? In the
Yeah.
absence of that, what we've got is uncertainty. Because, if you're going to review 400 customs duty exemptions, then everybody who's got an exemption will be lobbying like mad in order to retain it. Others will be lobbying that you shouldn't retain it. And you don't have
Sure.
some principles that you've laid out for what you want to
Yeah.
get to. You're just creating uncertainty. So that's not a very
Sure.
good,
Sure.
good situation. That's my feeling.
Okay, so let me get back to one of the initial questions and the comments that you made is on the fiscal deficit. You said that 6.8 itself is a very large number. Historically, we've outside of GFC, we've never gone in that direction. Do you think the new glide path that the government has given at 4.5% of fiscal deficit by FY25? So these next 3-4 years, is it only coming clean that's going to raise the fiscal deficit, or it's actually going to be a better, larger expenditure which is going to be beneficial for the economy? What do you think? Is the glide path better?
No, I think, let me say that for the coming year, I'm not unhappy with the 6.8%,
Sure.
because just as happened in the case of the financial crisis, you do a stimulus in the year of the crisis, but then you have to continue it for one more year. The critical thing is, after that, are we seriously going to bring the fiscal deficit down? If I could believe that we are seriously going to bring the fiscal deficit down 4% or 4.5% over 3 or 4 years, I think what markets and rating agencies will look at is what's the growth rate. Any fiscal deficit is much worse if the growth rate is low, and it's not that much worse if the growth rate is high. So the question really will be, is India back to a 6.5%, 7% growth path? If we are, and you'll know that probably by the year 2022, that the economy is now beginning to get back between 6 and 7%, I'm not even talking about 8%, then I think the somewhat higher fiscal deficit probably is sustainable. I don't believe any rating agency is going to downgrade a country which has otherwise stable macroeconomic parameters and 6 and 7% growth because it thinks the fiscal deficit is too high. Also, the debt to GDP ratio is just a number. I mean, there's nothing sacrosanct about a particular number. These numbers are really used to anchor a discussion. Now, quite frankly, the Maastricht fiscal deficit of 3%, even in Europe, that was criticized as being arbitrary. In any case, it's relevant for a slow growing economy. Economies are growing at 2.5%. If India is really growing at 6 and 7%, then the debt to GDP ratio will come down because of the growth of the economy. So I think we need to look at that. And I think our rating agencies will be watching that very carefully. If it turns out that our growth rate is not picked up, people will say we better look at why it's not fixed up. Certainly don't jack it up just by spending money. I mean, spending money is no way of raising the rate of growth. And all this discussion about capital, it's true that if any given fiscal deficit is more tolerable if it's for capital investment than if it's for subsidies. So mind you, I mean, the notion of capital versus non-capital. I mean, if we want more education and more health, that's not necessarily capital expenditure. So really, we need to cut wasteful expenditure. And I think they've done some of that in the current budget. Many other parts of the budget have been squeezed. And if not very useful schemes are phased out, that's a good thing. But long term, in my view, it's absolutely critical that the ratio of tax revenues to GDP rises. And all studies show that India could India's tax to GDP ratio, state and center combined, is about 5 to 6 percentage points of GDP less than it should be. So
Right.
over a 5-year period, we need to know what's the tax reform strategy. Now, I think there's a lot that needs to be done there in direct taxes, simplification. I mean, there is a direct tax code which is being worked upon. I think it should be unveiled. We should know what it is. I think we need to simplify Indian taxes and make Indian taxes investor friendly, increase the predictability of Indian taxes. And that's the complaint that most, not just foreign investors, but even
Yeah.
domestic investors have. And the other
Sure.
thing, by setting unrealistic revenue numbers, we just push our revenue officers to chase unrealistic targets. And that forces them to make unrealistic assessments. And it's a kind of vicious circle. So we need to break that. I'm not expecting that this would have been solved in the budget because it's not a budget matter. But what we
Right.
have to look at is that happening? And similarly for the GST, I mean, everybody tells you that you want more revenue from the GST. For God's sake, just have three rates, 15% for virtually all commodities. That's a very big change from the present situation, and I don't know whether we're going to move there. I think it's
Sure.
also
Sure.
true that we need to go to low customs duties. Customs duties should not become a source of revenue. And this is another problem. You will never, if the revenue situation is not resolved through sensible tax reform, the ability to reduce customs duties will be seriously hampered because people
Right.
will say we can't afford to lose revenue.
That's right. So let me pick a statement that you made that spending, doesn't ensure growth, right? You have to get back growth. What is your stance on this new, probably I could call it a global fad of the modern monetary theory? Every government in the world is trying to print more money, spend, and try to reflate the economy, get the growth back. Do you think this is a strategy which will work over time, or what are the pitfalls to it?
Well, look, first of all, no government is actually saying that we are following a strategy of print more money. I mean, they
Okay.
all say this is a temporary thing. Even today in the United States, there's a debate going on whether the new Biden administration's additional fiscal stimulus is affordable or not affordable. And you've
Right.
got, Larry Summers, who's the former Secretary of the Treasury, saying that it's not affordable. I mean, he's being rather polite because he's a Democrat himself. But what he said is that this is not consistent with the sensible macroeconomics. The truth of the matter is that you run a risk of inflation. I mean, if you
Right.
print a lot, you can always, if you're borrowing in your own currency, which we typically are, then you can basically print more money to repay the debt. But if you let the money supply then get out of control, you're going to risk high inflation. And if you want to prevent that inflation, you'll be jacking up interest rates. And if you're jacking up interest rates, A, you'll be constraining growth. B, you'll be bringing in a lot more money from abroad, exposing yourself unnecessarily to foreign exchange risks. And that runs the risk that if that something goes wrong with those flows, you put the exchange rate under serious pressure, and that raises inflation because import costs go up. So printing money is I think for the current year, a loose monetary policy was right. That is the year 2021. I think the Reserve Bank did the right thing. That's what everybody has done. My guess is that next year, if the fiscal deficit is actually being reduced a little bit, not very much, a little bit, then the Reserve Bank will be under pressure because its inflation rate has already gone a little higher than it should be. It cannot keep on following a loose money policy. So they will be thinking of changing stance. And that's
Right.
the position that we're in. Now, it doesn't
Sure.
matter
Sure.
in the short run because, of course, you'll be crowding out the private sector. But the private sector at the moment is not really ready to invest. My guess is that it's when output levels get back to what they were in 2019-20 that companies will say, okay, it's now time to expand capacity and restock and so on. And I think that'll happen in the course of this coming year. And to be ready for that, I think we should be withdrawing the fiscal stimulus. gradually. But certainly by 22-23, which is the next financial year, we should be doing that. Now, remember, the budget has made very ambitious statements about infrastructure, pipeline, and all this kind of
Yes.
stuff. All these expenditures will build up. And also, I think we're not providing enough for defense. I mean, India's defense and security situation is a challenging one. I mean, I don't have to go into that, but it's a challenging one. And we almost certainly need to plan over the next 4 or 5 years to increase defense expenditure by about 0.5% of GDP, if not a little more. We also need to do a lot more on R&D, both by giving incentives to the private sector and by expanding domestic government R&D expenditure. So that is an additional. Then there's infrastructure. So look at it this way. We have all these demands for more expenditure, and we want to reduce the deficit. Now, the only way you can do that is for revenues to pick up. So the easy way of picking up revenues is privatizing, monetizing assets. The government has said that they're going to do that, and I think that's a very good signal. The crux of that is that those efforts can be easily stymied in implementation. I mean, when it comes to selling land, for example, you better have a very transparent system and process so that nobody later on says, how come you did this?
Right.
And similarly for privatization, you better not have unrealistic expectations of how much you're going to get for selling these enterprises. You know, many of them are loss-making. We don't know what conditions will be put. Can you scale down the labor force, or are you forced to retain? You know, it's very easy to impose what look like reasonable conditions on a sale, would just lead to the sale not happening.
Sure. So this budget, taking a cue from your comments on capital expenditure, this budget takes the capital expenditure to GDP number to 2.3%, which has been languishing at 1.8 or so. And we've been in sort of an investment winter for almost 9 years now. I think since FY13, it's been going down. And you also spoke about monetizing assets. So if you look closely, there are a lot of foreign funds who've been aggressively buying infra assets in India. They've been committing long-term funds, but the government agencies like the NHAI, they have not been able to monetize assets successfully. So how do you see this whole logjam breaking on investments? What is missing? What are we missing here?
You made a very important point there. Because any asset sale of the public sector can always be criticized that you've sold the government silver. I mean, we've been having these criticisms in different governments. I mean, the last government that did a serious effort at privatizing was the BJP government under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, where Arun Shourie was the Minister for Disinvestment. He got a few privatizations done, which proved to be highly successful, and then ran into a slew of allegations which caused the whole thing to stop. So I think you need a system where officials do not feel that they will be held responsible for having done the wrong thing. Also, you probably need a system where no single minister is held responsible. I mean, after all, Arun Shourie is a bold person, and he took the responsibility and he suffered for it in his own party. So I think you need a collective leadership. If a collective leadership gives a clear signal that, look, we believe we should privatize these companies, they will do better in the privatized mode than they would in the public sector mode, then there will be no allegation. There may be political criticism, but there will be no allegations as otherwise happen. So if it is left simply to a bureaucratic process, I think it's very vulnerable. I mean, I hope that it still works. The way to support the bureaucrats getting it done is, first of all, give them a very clear signal that we actually want it done. Also to give them a signal that it will be criticized, but the government is willing to take on that criticism at the political level. You provide a transparent way in which that can go ahead. Now, I think this can be done. And we have to see whether the government does it or not.
Right. So just one small point on that investments again. What do you think is the missing piece where our investments to GDP has been falling? GFC hasn't risen. Is it only the private sector where the capacity utilization levels haven't gone up, or is it really that our growth is not strong enough for us to get back private investments?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned private investment because you mentioned the fact that capital expenditure has gone up by less than 0.5% of GDP, and
Yeah.
everybody is calling that a big boost for growth. Let's face it, 0.5% of GDP is welcome. But the reason our growth rate has slowed down is because our overall investment has gone down by about 6% of GDP. I mean, it used to be
Right.
34%. The last it was 28, maybe even lower now. So this increase in the budget capital expenditure is very good, but it is not at all a solution to the growth process. The growth process will get resolved when private investment gets into the picture. Now, what does it take for private investment to come back in? To be honest, a lot of economists will give you some gobbledygook answer, but the reason people use words like animal spirits is that nobody really knows. I mean, investment is always an act of faith. But I would say that, for example, the global economy is now seen to be recovering faster than earlier thought. And the global vaccinations have started. We've started. Ours is the largest vaccination program. So if that vaccination program moves rapidly, and in my view, we should do it not just through the public sector, but also bring in the private sector to expand the vaccination program. If in 3 months it looks as if we have massively increased the rate of vaccination, that will create a sense of confidence that things are coming back to normal. I mean, remember, when a person who's lost a job regains a job, he doesn't immediately start spending because he's not sure whether he's going to hang on to the job or not. But if he regains a job 3 months later, and meanwhile, herd immunity has increased, vaccinations have increased, the economy looks going up, and more than that, foreign investment is pouring into India. I mean, it's unfortunate, but we very often take our signals as to whether things are going well from whether others think we're doing well or not. So that what people think how India is behaving is very important. So I think these things taken together, I would say there's one other thing, and that is that, this is my own preoccupation, but I feel the way India can look good is if we give a very, very clear signal that Atmanirbhar does not mean a kind of anti-import, shut out the imports, rely only on domestic products. It really means joining the world and being able to compete. Now, to be fair to the government, many government pronouncements have said so. I mean, they've said that Atmanirbhar is not protectionism. We want to integrate with global supply chains. We want India to become more integrated with the world. But I fear that our actions do not live up to that particular objective. And I mean, one of the things there is what is our policy on import duties. The other thing is joining an organization like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. This is the trade cooperative agreement in Asia, which is the most prosperous part of the world and the one part of the world which is opening up. Now, all these countries are dealing with China, and I know they're all nervous about China. They would be less nervous if India was part of it. And I regret the fact that we have decided, so far we have decided we're going to stay out. I think if the government were to change its mind and decide to join RCEP, it was globally send a signal that, look, India is the place to invest in if you want to build global supply chains. So if you're moving out of China, why don't you go into India? And that's what we say we want to do. But the question is, what is necessary in order to achieve it? That's the point.
Right. You mentioned, regression to raising excise duty. You mentioned customs duty. You're now also mentioning our integration to the global economy. So over the last, I think, about 8 years, Indian exports from point to point, they are stagnant. We did about 300 billion in FY13, if I remember correctly, and we are still at that level. And I don't see many levers where exports are going to grow exponentially. Do you think for example, FTAs, which have eluded us for a while. We don't have an FTA with Eurozone and many other parts of the world. What is the way forward for India's global trade? Do you see that we recover when, for example, yeah,
I'm quite confident. Global trade will never boom the way
yeah,
it did in the last 20 years. So it will slow down. But global
sure,
trade is going to grow. Okay. We have traditionally talked about a multilateral rules-based system. But the honest truth is, we've liked a rules-based system which gave an exemption to rules for us. In other words, we can do whatever we like, but everybody else must be open. I mean, to put it very crudely. I think that game is over. Things have
right,
become more reciprocal. So what's going to happen is that the global trading is going to get regionally blocked out. There'll be a North American area, there'll be a European area, and there's the Asian area. I have no doubt whatsoever that we should join the Asian one. We should also negotiate with Europe and also with the United States. Those will be a little more difficult because, in the case of the United States, for example, they will bring in all kinds of conditions on intellectual property, labor rights, this, that. I think we also have to recognize that, trade negotiations are not goodwill activities. They are hard negotiations where you have to concede something in order to gain something. And I think
right,
our tendency has been that we publicly declare what is our red lines, our first demand, and don't want to resile from them. The truth is, we should say, look, this is what we want. But depending on how much you give us, we may be willing to concede somewhere else. And you have to concede to what they want. You can't
right,
sort of say this is what we want, and we're not going to concede to anything you want. And I think probably we could reach an agreement with Europe faster than we can reach with the United States. And we should push for that. Traditionally, there are a few things there which relate to customs duties on automobiles and automobile parts, and also custom duties on French wines and things like that. I mean, to my mind, we should go ahead. Those are not
right,
things to worry about. And of course,
sure,
we should push for access for our products. We are now major milk producers in the United States. I mean, Europe has all kinds of, health kind of conditions which limit imports. Well, they're not actually going to concede those. So we just have to meet those health conditions. I mean, I don't think anyone, when restrictions are being placed not to protect producers, but to protect their own consumers on health grounds, no country is going to sort of dilute that. And we better recognize that. It's like saying, look, if you want to sell something in Europe, these are the standards it has to meet. So we have to ask ourselves, I mean, how do we meet them? Now remember, Europe is not producing all these things itself. It's
right,
importing them from others. So if others can meet them, why can't we?
sure, sir. So taking this discussion forward, MSME I think is a big exporter in India. They've been hit hard by the pandemic. If you look at the overall numbers, I think some numbers put that about 18 million jobs were lost, specifically in the MSME. And small and informal sector, it hasn't really seen the recovery that the formal side of the economy has seen.
Yeah.
So to say, it looks like a K-shaped kind of a recovery. Do you think that the budget in any way, and so to speak, the policies that done over the last 9 months, does it address that? Are we going to see a resurgence in the informal sector in FY22 onwards?
Well, I don't think we should blame the budget for this. There's a tendency, there seems to be a budget is a national economics festival, as if,
Right,
everybody expresses views on economics in those 5 or 6 days around the budget. I think
right,
the MSMEs face some very major structural constraints, and I don't think there's anything the budget could have done other than put in a little bit of shairi,
right,
poetry, to appeal to them. I mean, what are the problems? I mean, I think one of the fundamental problems for the MSMEs is that A, they don't have nearly as good infrastructure support as they need in order to be truly competitive. And at least half the infrastructure they're dealing with is with the state governments and not the center. I mean, every state government cross subsidizes farmers and home consumers using electricity by overcharging industry. And it's the small and medium industry that actually gets hit by that. So people have to recognize that if you want to make your medium industry competitive, you need to fix this problem. That's point number one. Point number two is that logistics. You know, there are any number of studies that have been done which show that if you judge productivity according to what happens within a factory, the Indian worker is as productive as the Chinese worker. But the difference is that to get material to the factory and to take it to the port, it takes three to four times as much time for the Indian factory than it does for the Chinese factory. That's a logistics and infrastructure problem, which is a combination of central and state, and is all these ease of doing business issues which are crucial. The biggest constraint other than these is finance. I mean, we
Right.
don't have a financing and banking system which gives support to MSMEs to the extent to which it should. And then finally, this is a problem where we have to be honest with ourselves. Unfortunately, we have an MSME sector which is hugely fragmented. I mean, the vast majority of our MSMEs employ less than 10 workers. To be a strong and competitive production unit in the modern age with changing technology, you can only survive. You can survive as a small scale manufacturer, but you need to be a much larger size unit than these very small units. This is going to this presents a structural change problem. What it really means is many of the existing MSME units will not survive as separate units. They'll get subsumed. Their space will be taken by the more efficient, the more modern, and somewhat larger MSME units who will expand, hire people, and other units will phase out. I don't think anyone wants to acknowledge this publicly, and certainly no politician wants to do that, and I can understand that. But frankly, unless we can do that, we will not be able to create good quality jobs in the MSME sector. So it's the unwillingness on our part to recognize that structural change is needed, not that the structure will remain the same and every MSME will grow at double-digit level. That's not going to happen.
Sure. Sure.
And
Sure.
how to achieve that is a huge problem. Of course,
Sure.
labor is a big issue, and some changes have been made, which are probably good. More facility for hiring contract labor. That's a good thing. Raising the limit on which the Industrial Dispute Act applies from 100 to 300 is not a huge change because it was 300 in 1982 when it was raised to, when it was lowered to 100. The fact of the matter is that if you want to create an incentive for smaller companies to start hiring between 500 and 1,000 workers, you need labor flexibility in that range. That requires a lot of persuasion, bringing the unions on board, telling them that, look, this is the only way to survive. And frankly, these things cannot be done instantly. They are much easier to do if you can get growth back. I mean, if we were doing these changes, having restored growth, we would be able to do it more easily. And truth is, we did have growth. It's not that we've never had high growth. So let's get the
Right.
growth back and meanwhile get all these things done. And that'll take
Sure.
care of some of these things in the medium term.
Sure. So we touched upon, let's say, labor and somewhat, I think, land, law and order, scale. All of these are problems. One thing you spoke about earlier, which is a worry even from the budget point of view, and I think it's a worry for over the years now, is fixing the banking system. Right? Banking contributes most to India's credit, and our incremental credit hasn't really risen. I think if you just smoothen the numbers over the last 5 years, we've been doing banking credit of not more than 7 lakh crores incrementally every year, which is too small, right? What do you think is a solution to India's banking problem? Most countries see it as a cyclical problem. NPS go up, they come down, and then the economy gets back on track. But we seems to be in a very sticky wicket. It continues to remain with us for a very long time.
Again, it's a structural problem. I mean, it's a structural problem because although the share of the public sector banks in total credit is now shrinking, it's still well over 60% or something like that.
Yes.
I believe that retaining the present system with government having a majority stake in the public sector banks does not give enough flexibility to the bank managers to behave in a dynamic manner. I mean, it's not widely known, but the Reserve Bank of India does not have as much regulatory power over public sector banks as it does over private sector banks. Over the private sector banks, it has the regulatory power to get rid of a management if they think the management is not performing well. In the case of public sector banks, it doesn't have that power. That power is really rests with the Ministry of Finance. So public sector banks are controlled both by the Reserve Bank of India and by the Finance Ministry. In my view, and almost anybody who's looked at this in the financial system from a technical point of view has said this is wrong. That we should put the two banks under the regulation of the RBI on an even keel. This will almost certainly, ideally, this should require privatization of our public sector banks. If you can't privatize the banks, then for a while, I mean, here I would give a lot of good marks to the budget that it has said that we're going to privatize two. Now, you know, all our reforms seem to take too long. So let's say if in the first year, the finance minister succeeds in privatizing two banks, and that goes well, then maybe in the next year she can privatize another four. And if that also goes well, we will have made a lot of progress. But if these two get stuck, and I can easily envisage circumstances where they would be stuck, we would be back where we are today. I do think that we should recognize that you cannot do. I'm not saying, by the way, that our bank managers are not competent. It's just that as long as they are public sector banks and are treated like civil servants, they are subject to all kinds of rules and regulations which are simply not consistent with good banking. And unless we get out of that, we will not get a really good banking system. You know, private sector banks are not without problems. I mean, they also have NPAs. Their NPAs also rose, but at a much lower level. I mean, the public sector banks are huge.
Right. So you're saying that largely this problem will probably become smaller and smaller as you see the size of the private banking sector, size of the private banks in the whole banking sector has been going up steadily over the last 15 years. So you're saying that...
Why do we want to wait another 15 years? See, what is actually happening is we don't seem to mind privatizing the banking sector.
Right.
But we mind privatizing public sector banks. Frankly, if the idea is to make these banks healthy, why not privatize a few of them? I'm not so happy with the idea of picking the two weakest ones and privatizing them. May not have been a bad idea to pick two middle-range banks. I don't know which banks are finally going to be picked. There's speculation in the press. But I think, you know, maybe one weak bank and one middle-order bank actually being privatized and sort of new strategic management brought in, and we review the experience in 2 or 3 years' time. Remember, when you change management, it takes a long time to get the system running again. You won't know whether it's a success for at least 3 years, and maybe even more.
Right. So another point that you highlighted earlier is with respect to GST. You said it's a great step, but you know it's messy right now. So two-part question. First is, do you think that we have a standard rate you have in mind that should be applicable, and what is the actual GST collection that we should have? I remember when late Mr. Arun Jaitley presented GST for the first time, he said that we should be collecting about 13 lakh crores a year. And we still haven't reached that number. I think it's about 3 years, 3.5 years now.
We haven't reached that number, that's for sure. No, look, my view on the GST is we should have a small number of essential commodities which are exempt. Today, almost 50% of the consumption basket is exempt. This is wrong. For most of the rest, we should have a single uniform rate of 14 or 15%. This will actually make it much easier for smaller businesses to cope with GST. Otherwise, small businesses having to pay GST at different rates depending on different products, And sometimes the products are defined also quite differently. I mean, I don't know, for example, whether biscuits with cream have a different GST rate than biscuits without cream, that kind of stuff.
Right.
I think that's just nonsensical. And I think the reason it happened is that when the matter went to the GST Council, many of the state finance ministers felt that no, GST must be progressive. How can things which are consumed by richer people attract a higher rate of tax, lower the same tax as something consumed by poorer people? But the fact is that if you exempt essential commodities, then most of the consumption of the poor is in that category. And on the rest, they pay a uniform tax. And it's the personal taxation, the direct taxation, that brings in progressivity. Now, GST Council has nothing to do with direct taxation, so they're taking a silo-like view on the GST
Right.
by itself. I think this is an essay in persuasion, which is what Dr. Manmohan Singh used to call all reforms. This is an essay in persuasion which the central finance minister has to undertake with her colleagues, which are the state finance ministers, and get it done.
Right. Sir, over the years, manufacturing has been eyed by different governments, that it will become the backbone. And there is a lot of narrative globally that whatever China is abandoning, other countries will take up, to become a manufacturing powerhouse. Incidentally, our own manufacturing production has averaged about just 3% pre-COVID over the last 7-8 years, and about a percent if you add the last year disruptions. Do you think we have the capacity and the policy framework to at least make things that Indians consume domestically, or probably also go and sell outside the country? What is the framework for that?
No, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that China is 5 times richer than we are. So it's not that we are grabbing market from China. China is just vacating these markets because its wage levels and income levels are now too high, and the market is open for other countries. What's happening is that Vietnam and Bangladesh are able to grab these markets. So we have. If you ask me, can we compete with Vietnam and Bangladesh, not meaning any disrespect to either, because they're both doing quite well. I don't see any reason why we can't compete effectively with them. And we should have done a better job getting those markets. Now, our producers will tell you that they are subject to many constraints, restrictions, etc. And I think the solution is we should recognize that problem, address that problem directly. It is not a solution to say, so let's raise our duties and we'll give you protection and you just turn inwards. That would be an absolute disaster. We are not a large enough economy to turn inward. I mean, all said and done, for many things, we're actually quite a small economy. So we need an approach where we say, look, we're not going to produce everything, but we're going to be the most competitive producer of certain things. And globally, in global supply chains, people will use Indian products in those supply chains. That's what our aim should be.
Sure.
And I have no reason to believe that we can't do it. Look, for years, government after government has been talking of double-digit growth in manufacturing. At one point during the UPA period, we did reach 9%, but we never actually crossed 10% for any extended period. To go from 9%, at that time we reached it. First of all, we should get back to that growth rate. And that was a period when our exports were also expanding.
Right.
Our exports are so small that unless you believe that the world exports are going to collapse, and nobody believes that. Certainly not in these simple products, because Western economies are not going to produce these simple products themselves. So the fact is, things are open. We could do better. We can do a better job of manufacturing. I do agree that we should be focusing on manufacturing. I don't take the view that it doesn't matter whether we do manufacturing as long as we're doing a good job on services. As a matter of fact, at the moment, we are in serious danger of losing our competitive advantage in services because we've been into the low end of IT type services. We haven't really broken through into the higher end, which is what we should be doing.
Sure, sure. So let me ask you a question, which is a very hot burning topic right now, so to say, which is the you see this agri reforms? Are they really liberalizing agriculture markets? Are there any parallels to draw between what we've done earlier? And also your opinion on how this farmer protest should be handled. I mean, what is the way forward for this?
Well, first on the reforms, let me say, I mean, I've spoken on this before and written about it. And in fact, in the UPA, when I was deputy chairman, we did argue that we need modernization of agricultural markets and allowing a greater role for the private sector and not just a monopoly of APMCs, I think is a good thing. Bringing the private sector into food processing, encouraging, giving them an environment where they can start buying and stocking, which requires getting rid of the Essential Commodities Act, allowing contract farming. I think these are good things. We had recommended them earlier. You remember, in our case, I mean, many of these things are really being agricultural market related. My understanding always was that constitutionally this has to be done in the state governments. So we produced a number of model state laws. The Vajpayee government did that, and the UPA also did something like that. And we would tell the state governments, look, why don't you do it? So the debate was being conducted with state governments. I think what has happened is that the present government has interpreted the Constitution in a way that they can actually legislate in this area. Now, I'm not competent to pronounce whether that's constitutionally correct or not. That only the Supreme Court can do. But the objective, I feel that what has gone wrong is that farmers feel that there hasn't been adequate consultation. It is true that in the when these laws were first introduced, they were introduced as an ordinance, which, I mean, which is something you do in an emergency, but the normal thing would be that you have a discussion in Parliament. The discussion in Parliament was hardly there at all when these were converted, when the ordinances were converted into acts. And I think beyond that, what has happened is that the political protest has raised a number of fears, which I don't think were necessarily there in the laws. I mean, there's the fear that the government intends to get rid of MSP, get rid of mandis. Government has said it doesn't intend to do that, but clearly the two sides need to sit down and talk. I think it reflects the fact that in any democratic environment, uh, you have to be able to persuade people. I mean, persuading your opponents that their fears are misplaced cannot be a bad thing. Now, government is discussing with them. I sincerely hope that they come to some kind of a solution. To be fair, the government has shown a measure of flexibility. I don't know whether the farmers are going to accept this or not, but my hope is that they will come to some resolution. And if there are fears that they have, then those fears can be taken care of in any new kind of legislation that is brought in. I mean, for example, one of the fears that farmers expressed is that under the law, if there's a dispute, they can't go to court. I don't know if this is technically correct or whether they first have to go to the district administration. They feel the district administration will be dominated by corporate interests. They feel they should be able to go to court. I think the government has agreed that they can go to court. So, many of these things could have been resolved, and I think they should be resolved even now. Then, underneath it all, there's a deeper suspicion that has been thrown up in the political process, which is a kind of anti-corporate sector. These guys will come and they will dispossess us of our land, etc. Now, I don't think there's anything in the laws that does that, but I think you need a political process of discussion. That is, you see, in the days when we thought that this could be done by state governments, these issues would have been resolved at the state level. It's because they've been taken up in a central legislation that the issue has become sensitive. So government has to resolve it somehow.
Sure. So let me ask you a last two-part question. Do you feel optimistic about the trajectory of Indian economy, specifically, let's say, after the budget and what has happened over the last 9 to 10 months? And the second is, what do you think is the dark horse for the economy now? Is it the resurging real estate sector, which hasn't really done anything over the last 12 years? Or do you feel more optimistic about manufacturing? Or it is just going to be the whole private consumption pulling up aggregate demand? Your comments on these two.
Well, look, on the question of being optimistic about the Indian economy, I'm a congenital optimist, and therefore I'm optimistic about the Indian economy. I've worked within different governments over a period of more than 30 years, and during that period, I've seen growth steadily increase. I've also seen a growing consensus on what the future directions of policy should be, although this sometimes gets swamped by our political process. I mean, in a democracy, politics is not a consensual thing. I mean, the job of oppositions is to oppose, and governments should let them oppose and sort of rely on discussion to persuade people about what's the right thing. Even in a simple thing like insurance, when it was first moved by Chidambaram in the United Front government, the BJP strongly opposed it. And they said they weren't going to do any of this. Then when the Vajpayee government came, the BJP itself brought in foreign direct investment into insurance. But it was 24%. Then when the UPA came, Chidambaram wanted to raise it to 49%, and the BJP totally opposed it. Then when the Modi government came, one of the first things they did was to raise it to 49%. Now they're raising it to 74%. So, if you look at these at any given time, you would think that Indian politics is impossible to make progress because chaps are always fighting with each other. But if you look at the whole story, what comes out is that it's what Winston Churchill used to say about the Americans. That the Americans can be counted upon to do the right thing after they've tried all the other ways of doing it. So we seem to take these positions, but over time we seem to build up a consensus on what's a sensible thing to do. Now, I think I am concerned about some of the trends that we see, particularly the closing the economy trend. But otherwise, the basic idea that we are going to do more infrastructure, the basic idea that the private sector has to lead, the basic idea that ease of doing business is important, basic idea of privatizing banks, although I think we're doing it far too slowly, I think these are good things. So I remain optimistic that somehow people will find a way of getting these things done. And here and there, where I think we're stepping back, maybe they'll think again and rethink their own positions. So that's my view. I don't believe that this economy has seen 7.5 to 8% growth over 10 years. And that was a period when lots of jobs got created. They didn't create high quality jobs, but they created a lot of jobs and poverty went down. That has all disappeared in the last 4 or 5 years. I think whatever the government does, they should bring it back. And I think the expectation will be that it should be possible to bring it back because the same economy did all this just a short while ago. So that's my view on the overall picture. Now, on these specific things, I've lost track of the specific questions that you raised. What was it, by the way?
What is the dark horse for the economy? Which sectors do you think?
I think the dark horse, is employment. Because let me say, if everything works well, I can imagine a situation where we get to 7.5% growth, manufacturing also expands. But we have to recognize that technology is changing. And if we're going to be integrated with the rest of the world, we have to accept the new technologies. And the new technologies are going to be more capital intensive and less labor intensive. So this is going to make it very, very difficult to create jobs. You'll be losing a lot of jobs and creating some jobs.
Right.
The only way you can offset that is by growing faster and kind of somehow generating enough jobs. this has to be done in a framework where growth is also sustainable. I mean, this is something nothing to do with politics or technology, although technology does provide a solution. We cannot ignore the impact of growth on the environmental consequences of growth. And you can see that in air pollution and any number of things, water pollution, all things which the government kind of recognizes. But while every government, the UPA did that, the present government, they put out programs, for cleaning the Ganga, sewage
Right.
program, this program. These programs are a very, very small scale thing. We require very basic changes in the way the system is organized. For example, on sewage, water, and so on. I mean, the urban governance has to be massively reformed, and which means that urban revenues have to be massively increased, and state governments have to devolve a lot of effective power to cities, which they're not willing to do. These are not problems that the center can solve. They have to be solved by the state. But having said all that, I remain. Look, we're still a low middle income country. We should forget the notion that we're suddenly going to keep growing at 10% because we've done some reforms. Actually, in order to grow at 7.5% or so, we need to keep thinking of the new sets of reforms that we need. But at any given time, we should know what are the reforms that will give the biggest bang for the buck over the next 2 or 3 years, and concentrate on those. And not only concentrate on those, see if they're actually getting done. It's very easy to announce a reform and then it doesn't get done. And we need systems that pursue implementation of reform, and also very frankly acknowledge what the nature of the constraint is. And that requires a lot of hard work and good governance.
Sure. So I think on that note, on that optimistic note, I think we know that India is a noisy economy. We see a lot of noise around, but we get it done. As you said, over a period of time, if we see at a 20-year block period, we get things done. And I'm sure that over the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of new things will happen. Growth rates will jump back. And I think that's the word from Mr. Ahluwalia. So thanks a lot for joining us. We've run out of time. It's been an honor to have a chat with you, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, all of them have gained a lot today. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you very much. And I have a request. You must have received questions from your various participants, some of which you would have reflected to me, but some which you may not have. I'll be very grateful if you send me a soft copy of what those questions were, so I get a sense of what is it that the viewers really were interested in. Okay?
Definitely. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir.